Jurassic Park will go down in history as being the game changer. The film pushed the transition of special effects into the digital era and forever changed the way that movies are made. But they didn't do this by making a sudden evolutionary leap, or by accomplishing dozens of groundbreaking visual effect firsts. For example, they didn't create the first realistic CG animal, which was a flying owl in the opening credits of the 1986 film Labyrinth. They weren't the first to do a digital composite of a full-screen live-action image, which was Donovan's death in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade in 1989. They weren't the first to combine live-action and CGI. That was Tron in 1982. And they weren't even the first to realistically animate a CG dinosaur. That was done 3 years earlier for a documentary called Stegosaurus, the roof lizard. But what they did do was create some of the most believable special effects ever made. And they did so by adding some relatively small effects that helped to immerse their puppets, animatronics and CGI so deeply in reality that it made it almost impossible to believe they weren't real. Firstly, in order to get the most realistic results, Phil Tippett created some 3D storyboards that he called animacs. These allowed the filmmakers to see how each dinosaur would be required to move on screen, and therefore better decide which method of animation would be the most realistic to use in each case. The T-Rex was to be a combination of CGI and full-size animatronics, as was the Brachiosaurus. The sick Triceratops was an animatronic puppet, as was the Dilophosaurus. The Velociraptors were a combination of CGI, a puppet and a man in a suit, and all the wide shots, full body shots and shots with multiple dinosaurs in them were done using CGI. Next, they had to make the dinosaurs look as real as possible, and, in the cases where the dinosaurs had to be a combination of puppet, animatronic and CGI, as consistent as possible. And this was done by Industrial Light and Magic and Stan Winston and his team. To achieve realistic and scientifically accurate behaviour, they also worked alongside paleontologist Jack Horner. They started by creating highly detailed 1/12 and 1/5 scale models. These models were then 3D scanned by Industrial Light and Magic into the 3D modelling program Alias to make the digital dinosaurs, and then cut up into slices like a loaf of bread. Each of these slices were numbered and recorded. Then each piece was placed on a projector that projected the image at the correct scale onto a piece of wood. This wood was then marked and cut out with spaces, allowing for the metallic structure that would have to support the puppet. Molds were then taken from all the sculptures from which the skins were made to then go over the animatronic skeletons. Now that they had realistic dinosaurs and a realistic way of animating them, they now had to have a realistic way of filming them. It's no use having dramatic handheld camera movements when there are no effects if you have to lock down the camera or do a motion control shot when there are effects. So the VFX teams had to come up with clever ideas to be able to add their effects to Spielberg's dramatic shots. These white balls that you can see on the ground here were strategically placed so that ILM could draw a grid in the computer from which they could plot the actors' eye lines to match the camera movements frame by frame, to mimic it with their virtual camera and place their CG Gallimimus seamlessly within the shot. Now that they had realistic dinosaurs moving and shot in a realistic manner, they had to make them look like they weren't filmed separately, but actually belonged to the live-action plate. And to do this, they had to make them interact with people and the world on that plate. For example, the raptors in the kitchen scene wouldn't have seemed quite so real had they not had a wire attached to a ladle being pulled by this guy here. To achieve this interaction, the VFX teams had to pay close attention to the smallest details, like adding water splashes when the T-Rex's feet hit the ground. These water elements were filmed separately in front of a black background, or adding this puff of breath in the raptor scene, or having a real tree split here to give the CG T-Rex something to interact with. Jurassic Park has far too many of these little effects to be able to list them all here, but each and every one of them helped the fake dinosaurs sit well within the reality of the live-action plate. So now that finally they had realistic dinosaurs moving in a realistic way, filmed in a dramatically convincing manner, and interacting with the real world around them, they now needed to solve perhaps the biggest problem that arises when creating gigantic creatures, and in fact in creating any CG effect, even today. And that problem is selling the weight. Computer graphics have no mass. They don't weigh anything. Sure, you can make CG balls bounce at different speeds and heights to simulate different weights, but a real ball has mass and inertia, and this causes it to stretch and deform upon impact. The same thing happens when a foot impacts with the ground, or when we shake our heads. Unfortunately, at the time Jurassic Park was made, the technology just simply wasn't available to be able to simulate these complex deformations, and so Industrial Light and Magic had to hide their absence by using camera movement, motion blur, the darkness and rain, and then create the illusion of weight and inertia by using sound. Self-crushing props, camera movement, and clever little effects like the iconic water cup effect. Here they actually attached a guitar string to the underside of the dashboard and down through the car to the ground. Then they had someone underneath the car plucking the string to get the vibrations, and not only did it look good and create the tension that something big and heavy was coming, but it also pre-programs the audience into thinking what was coming was indeed big and heavy. Jurassic Park's special effects worked so well because the filmmakers were aware of the strengths and the weaknesses of the special effects they could produce, so they tried to avoid showing the dinosaurs until they absolutely had to. And when they had to, they hid them in shadows, smoke, or rain. And when they had to show them in the light, they made realistic puppets that they could show as briefly as possible. They understood that special effects, whether practical or digital, are basically just optical illusions, clever magic tricks that fool the viewer into believing whatever the filmmakers want them to. And just like magic tricks, they don't have to be extravagant or expensive. They just have to be so deeply bedded in reality and happen so quickly that you don't have a reason or the time to doubt what you just saw.